This is the Olympus M.Zuiko 12mm f2 with the model number EW-M1220. This lens is not part of the Pro series, but it's still a relatively good lens. It was announced in June 2011 and it weighs 130 grams and it has a length of 4.3 centimeters. So that's how much it protrudes from the body of the camera once it's attached. So I have the lens hood on here as well right now, which means it's a little bit longer than it would be otherwise. This lens doesn't have a lens hood thread, so you screw the lens hood on using this screw here. So there's a metal lens hood that you can buy for it, and you have to screw this tight on the actual lens. So there's a grip inside it that grips the lens like this, instead of actually having a thread which you actually twist the lens hood on. This lens hood is made out of metal and the model number is LH-48. So one of the disadvantages of having this type of lens hood is that it's obviously slightly more difficult to put on if you want to attach it using a single hand, because you have to put the lens hood on and then screw this in place. Whereas if it was one of those threaded lenses, you would just put it on and then twist it. So I think those ones are easier. And the other disadvantage of this lens hood is that it's relatively heavy, so it weighs 25 grams. And considering this lens itself only weighs 130 grams, attaching 25 grams to the front of it and making it a little bit front heavy is probably not ideal. And it adds around 3 centimeters to the length of the lens as well. So one thing about this type of lens design where there's no lens hood thread on the lens, this is actually good if you want to attach a matte box. So in that sense, the design is superior for those people who want to attach a matte box. But if you don't want to attach a matte box and you just want to use a lens hood, then I think the other designs where there's a thread on the lens and you just attach the lens hood, I think those are better. So it just depends on how you want to use this lens. The lens does have a focusing ring, and in addition to the focusing ring, it also has a clutch, so the focus ring can be pulled back like this, and it exposes the distance where the focus is, so both in meters and feet. And what that lets you do is you could have your camera on autofocus, and then once you pull this focus ring back, or focus clutch as they call it, then it goes into manual mode. So the lens stops to essentially take orders from the camera. Instead, you have to rotate it on the lens itself to get the exact focus. So this is really good if you're trying to get autofocus to focus on something and it's not doing what you expected, then you can quickly pull this back from its original position and then manually focus on the desired subject, which kind of gives you both the advantages of having autofocus, but you can also switch to manual focus really quickly. And obviously a lot of cameras, for example, like the Panasonic cameras as well as Olympus cameras, you can use this lever to switch between manual focus and continuous autofocus. So there is that, but I think the lens clutch is a little bit easier because you immediately go to twist this and you just pull it back and then you can twist it. The closest focusing distance for this lens is 20 centimeters and the diagonal angle of view is 84 degrees. So in my experience, when I compare this lens to the Pro lenses, I would say it's slower to focus. So even if you're just doing a single point autofocus, it's a little bit slower to obtain focus relative to the Pro series of M.Zuiko lenses. And also the metal mount, which you use to connect it to the camera, is not as smooth and as much of a nice fit as you have on the M.Zuiko Pro series lenses. So I think sometimes you have to like twist it a little bit or make sure the electronics are touching. I've had occasions where the lens wasn't recognized because I think the electronics weren't touching properly, but you can just play with it a little bit to make sure that it lines up properly. And because I don't use matte boxes with this lens, I'm not a big fan of the lens hood, which is heavier and also difficult to attach and detach, because if you want to put this in your camera bag, then it actually ends up taking up more space because it's too much hassle to unscrew this, reverse the lens hood, put it back and then screw it back in again. So that's why I prefer those plastic lens hoods that are both lighter and you can just unscrew them, put them back and then unscrew them and then put it forward again with a single motion with one hand, as opposed with this where you need to hold it with one hand and then screw it with the other hand. So it generates a little bit more work and effort. So let me just show this. So this is the kit lens that comes with some of the Olympus cameras. It's the 14 to 42mm, and this one has one of those plastic lens hoods which are light, and the lens actually does have a thread. So you can just put it on and take it off quite easily, and it locks into place. So I prefer these type of lens hoods. In terms of image quality, the image quality that this lens produces is good, but I would say it's not as good as the Pro Series M.Zuiko lenses. So there are certain backlit situations where the M.Zuiko Pro Series handle it better, so there will be less reflections or artifacts in the image from backlit situations. And also the Pro Series seem to have less distortion. But obviously the advantage of this one is that it has an aperture of f2 and is really small and light. So those are the main advantages of this lens. So one lens to compare this to would be the 12 to 45 M.Zuiko Pro series. So this obviously covers the 12mm wide angle, and obviously it's a zoom lens, but the quality on this lens, even though it's a zoom lens, is substantially higher than the 12mm f2. So it's part of the Pro series. But the disadvantage of this lens is that its aperture is f4, so that's one disadvantage. And the other disadvantage is that it weighs 254 grams, which is obviously substantially more than this one, which weighs 130 grams. And this one is 7 centimeters long, and obviously if you're zooming in, then it would be even longer if you consider it that way. So if you don't need the f2 aperture that this lens provides, then I think the M.Zuiko Pro lens 12 to 45 is actually much better in terms of the image quality, and it has a lighter lens hood as well, and it's a zoom lens, so you get a lot of benefits for the M.Zuiko Pro series 12 to 45, but you lose out on the aperture. And if I remember correctly, this one doesn't actually have a focus clutch, so you can't actually pull it back the way you could with this one to do manual focus. So it doesn't have a manual focus clutch. So there's the 12 to 40 f2.8. I don't know where I have that lens right now, but that lens does have a focus clutch if I remember correctly, but that one is even heavier. So that one weighs 382 grams and it's even bigger, so it's 8.4 centimeters, but that one has a big aperture, so the aperture is f2.8. So you have this one, which is 2, the 12 to 40, which is f2.8, and then there's the 12 to 45, this one here, which is f4. So you kind of have to decide between those. Each of them have their own compromises. One has a bigger range and is light. This one has a f2 aperture. The other one is somewhere in between. It's 12 to 40. It weighs more. It's bigger, but then it has the f2.8 aperture. Another lens which might be a reasonable comparison is this one, the Panasonic 14mm f2.5 Mark II. So this is one of those pancake lenses. The only disadvantage of this lens is obviously that it's 14mm as opposed to 12mm, and I think in a lot of scenarios that actually makes a big difference, and the aperture is f2.5 as opposed to f2, which is the case with the Olympus lens. But the advantage of this lens is that it only weighs 55 grams. So the Panasonic 14mm f2.5 weighs 55 grams, whereas this one weighs 130 grams, and then you have another 25 grams for the lens hood, which takes it to over 150 grams. So this lens ends up being 3 times heavier than the Panasonic Lumix one. And then there's the case of the aperture. So this is f2.5, whereas this one is f2. So the length of this lens, this one, the Panasonic one, is 2 centimeters, so 2.05 centimeters to be more exact, which is substantially smaller than the M.Zuiko 12mm f2. So this one is 4.3 centimeters. So whatever lens you choose, there are some compromises. And there's one more lens which I don't have, but that's worth considering as well, which is the Panasonic 12mm f1.4. So that one has a aperture of f1.4, which is even bigger than this one, but it weighs 335 grams and its length is 7 centimeters. But the advantage it has is that it has an aperture of f1.4. So if that's a really important factor for you, then that's one to consider. but the disadvantage is that it's bigger and heavier, substantially heavier. And I think there's a lot of other brands that create 12mm lenses in f2, f2.5 range of apertures. I think PerGear created one as well recently, although all of their lenses are more geared towards cinema usage, so they don't have any electronics or anything. That doesn't mean they're bad, but they don't have electronics, just something to be aware of when you're looking for these lenses. Just make sure that you get what you want. So not having electronics can also be a good thing. There's less things to break, and also you can get repeatable focus pulls. So if you're doing focus pull, you can have a start point and end point without any issues ahead of filming, and then you just repeat that focus pull when you're actually doing the filming, which is something that it would be really difficult to do with an electronic focus ring. Someone's written up a blog entry about how to fix the 12mm f2 M.Zuiko lens. So if that's something that you have or you're dealing with and you want to see the insides of it and how to fix a particular issue, then that's something you can look at. Anyway, let me know if you have any questions about this lens, or if you want me to compare it to any other lens, or if there's something I missed about the lens which I should have talked about more.